Nobody asked for this. This is unsolicited guitar advice. I've built a number of guitars, and you've seen a bit of a, you know, this brown one here, this Flying V, this green guitar here, a couple others, a mate for that Flying V. And anyway, over the years, when I've been playing them out here and there, people often say things like, I've always wanted to build my own guitar. I've always thought about building my own guitar, but I've never really had the wherewithal to sit down and do it. First off, if you're afraid of trying something and failing, you shouldn't do anything. You should just stop doing things, because you're gonna fail at something. We all do. You're gonna do something wrong, you're gonna screw something up, so that's life. Same thing goes with building a guitar. You're gonna screw up. I mean, you are. Do you think those two guitars don't have mistakes? They have mistakes. I can find them for you. I can find them for you. They aren't the things that other people notice, but you know what? This blue guitar, that has mistakes. That red one, that has mistakes. My Les Paul, that has mistakes from the factory. My Strat has mistakes. None of these things are perfect, and literally everything built from wood is imperfect in some way, because wood is by its own nature a temperamental material. So humidity, you may be good one day, and then 6 months later humidity shows up and just screws up your beloved plans. So that's the nature of building things from wood. That includes guitars built from wood, even solid body guitars. And so I'm just going to go through sort of a checklist of things to consider if you are interested in building your own guitar. Now, first off, I can't think, there hasn't been a better time to start. There has never been a better time to decide to build your own guitar than now. There are so many resources on the internet, it is insane. There are forums, there are YouTube channels. StuMac been around for years, but StuMac has all sorts of stuff now. Kits, guitar kits. So if you decide that you want to build a clone of a Telecaster or a Strat or a Les Paul and kind of get your feet wet that way, there's an entire array of kits that you can get involved with. So you can buy something that's basically, you know, like a Les Paul kit. I know I just got an ad earlier that on StuMac, they're like $200. Has everything you basically need except for, I think, paint. And pretty much you glue it together. The fretboard is done. So you're gluing the neck into the body, assembling it, wiring it, and finishing it. You know, obviously not in that order, but and then you have a guitar, and you get sort of a taste of it, and you can kind of scale that. There are other kits where maybe you need to do a little bit more work on the, you know, for a Les Paul style thing, maybe you need to do a little bit more work on the heel or on the neck joint, or, you know, that tenon that's on there, or maybe a little bit, you know, sanding work in the mortise, that sort of thing. Maybe there's a little bit more involvement. Maybe you need to put the fretboard on. Maybe you need to fret it. So you can take it all the way from something that's practically a finished guitar, all the way to plans and templates, all the way to sort of your own design. So, you know, a lot of this stuff, if you've ever thought about doing it, you can either find a really easy entry point if you want to build, sort of get your feet wet building a clone of something, or if you've always thought, you know, I've always had these ideas of what I'd like to build, there's an entire world of things that you need to think through before you ever cut a board, before you ever buy a board necessarily. So I just put some considerations together here that you need to think through if you're going to be building your own sort of version of, say, this green guitar, which is not a Les Paul. It's shaped like a Les Paul, and that's the only Les Paul thing about it. Or that Flying V, which is shaped like a Flying V, and that's the only Flying V thing about it. Everything else is different in them. So there's a lot of time and energy and effort, and honestly, it's a fun part of the process to sit through and think about what you're going to do. Are you going to do, let's say, if you want to do a Les Paul copy or if you want to do a Stratocaster copy, all right, you already know what your design parameters are. You already know what you're shooting for. So you can just start thinking about, okay, what woods do I want? What templates do I need to buy, et cetera, et cetera. If it's not a copy, you have a lot of stuff to consider. Construction style. What's the neck joint going to be like? What are other joints going to be like? Is it going to have a fender style headstock? 6 on the side headstock, or where the headstock is cut out of the same piece of wood that way, a Gibson style headstock? Are you going to do a scarf joint on your headstock? What angle are you going to set your headstock? What's your tuner alignment going to be like on your headstock? Just the headstock, there's a lot to think about with that. What kind of nut are you going to have on there? Are you going to do a fender style nut? Are you going to do a locking nut? Are you going to do a Gibson style nut? Is the nut going to be trapped between the overlay and the end of the fretboard like on a Gibson, or is it going to be a flat shelf that it sits on there? Trying to think, I can't think offhand what the brand is that has the flat shelf there, but that's just on the headstock, and that's something you need to know, because if you haven't figured that out and you start just hacking away on something, you're going to get to that point and go, oh yeah, I need to figure out how to do this, because that's another thing that you need to consider, how you're doing all these different things. Another one, neck construction. Are you going to do a one-piece neck? Are you going to do a separate headstock? Are you going to do like a laminate, 3-piece, 5-piece, reinforcements? Are you going to do carbon fiber rods in the neck? What kind of truss rod are you going to do? How are you going to have the truss rod sit in there? Are you going to do a flat truss rod channel? Are you going to do a curved one with a single action truss rod, double action truss rod? Your body, is it going to be a laminated body, one-piece body? Are you going to have a maple cap? Are you going to have a figured cap on it? Is it just going to be a simple piece of wood? What's your bridge going to be like? Your bridge determines your neck angle. So all of a sudden your neck joint construction has to come into play with your neck angle, the body shape, and then eventually electronics. So all of these things are things that you need to consider before you ever spend any money. I mean, you don't need to spend a dime to think through all of this. You don't have to spend a penny to sit down and just consider how all these things should work together to build a guitar. Obviously, if you want to have a tune-o-matic bridge, you're either going to be setting your neck at a slightly more extreme angle to the body than you would for, say, a Floyd Rose or a Strat style bridge, or you'll be recessing the bridge, like Mr. Green Guitar here. That was actually planned. I actually wanted to have a tune-o-matic recessed, but you see this funky tailpiece on here. That's actually a prototype that I haven't done anything with, for a finished tailpiece, which I originally planned to build for the guitar and never have gotten around to in the 9-ish years since I built it. And then once you know kind of how you want things laid out, then you have to figure out how you're going to do it. This is another thing that really doesn't cost any money at this point. Now, you can make a list of the tools that you have, and man, you go on the internet, and the internet's full of videos of people, like, guy turns a pallet into a beautiful guitar. It's like, oh yeah, he only used like $12,000 worth of tools to do it. Yeah, that's pretty hard to do when you have $12,000 of tools. You have everything at your disposal. You're like Norm Abrams, just sitting there, just like, just putting it through this and that. You get every jig in the world. The rest of us don't have that. So you have to figure out how you're going to do stuff. If you're going to do a scarf joint, you have to figure out, okay, I have a table saw. Okay, well then you have to figure out how to build a jig to cut scarves on a table saw. And you also need to figure out how you're going to clamp it up and how you're going to glue it, because glue is slippery, and that stuff, once you're starting to glue it, it wants to go right away. What's your tool budget? You probably don't have everything that you would want to have for that. And you may be sort of changing how you do things based on what your budget is. For example, you can buy pre-slotted fretboards, depending on the wood, for anywhere between, I think, like $15 to $50. It might be a bit more now for ebony or the rosewoods or that sort of thing, but you can get that. Now, that might be a more economical solution for you than buying a saw for fretting and a miter box, for example. Especially if you're just doing a one-off. If you're doing multiple things, maybe then it's worthwhile buying the tools then. But just a thing to consider too when you're looking at tools is you have to consider out what you're using the tool for. What I mean by that is, it's one thing to buy, purpose-made tools, but you're gonna spend a lot of money really fast buying purpose-made tools for luthiery. Not to say that they're bad, they're good. they can make a lot of work easier. But if you're doing that work once, it might not have been worth your purchase. Now, I will give an example here. I mentioned StewMac a fair bit because they're a pretty big player in, obviously, in luthiery and in guitar repair and building parts. This is one of their fret crowning files. I ordered this, gosh, it was last winter, and I haven't actually even used it yet. I've never had one before. I don't know how many guitars I've refretted and leveled and crowned. I've never owned one of these crowning files. It's like, well, how did you do it? And I did the time-honored method of buying a small triangular file at Ace Hardware and taking it to a grinder and grinding safe edges on it, and then just using the triangular file to shape the frets. Is it as quick as a crowning file? Probably not. But you know, that doggone thing is held up really, really well, and the frets were all crowned. I never had a customer complaint about the crowning. I never had a complaint about my own crowning. I was able to do fret ends with it really well. It all worked out really well. So, you know, that was a way that I spent. I can't remember what I spent on this now. Obviously, I have more money now than when I actually needed the doggone tools, which is the irony of life, I guess. But, you know, I spent $4 or $5, I think, on that file at the time. And I don't know how many dollars worth of repairs I have gotten out of it. And it still works. It's still a fully functional triangular file with safe edges ground into it. But that's an example of a way that you can use a tool that was not necessarily purpose-built, but still serves the function. Other examples would be, and I think I mentioned it on the nut slotting video, if you buy a calipers like the one that I've used right here, you can measure a lot of things to a pretty fine level, and that can be really nice for things like measuring the kerfs on saws. Now, the kerf of the saw is the way the teeth are. So, you know, we all know, let's pretend that these are each saw teeth. Obviously, they're fingers, but most saws don't have the saw teeth in a line like this. They're somewhat splayed out in order to actually help remove wood or whatever you're sawing. Could be a hacksaw. Hacksaws, you know, have a kerf too, obviously, to remove whatever material from where you're sawing. So the kerf is this right here, and so the distance is what you would be measuring here. So for example, if you're going to be fretting and you don't want to spend a bunch of money on a fretting saw, if you can find another saw that has what is it, 20 thousandths, I believe, is the width of the tang of a fret on a guitar. If you have another saw that has a kerf that big, then you can use that. I mean, you don't have to go buy a special saw necessarily. I mean, you can, but you wouldn't necessarily have to if you have another saw that actually can do the same thing, which is cut a slot that's 20 thousandths wide. Then use that saw, and you don't have to spend any extra money. You know, other things too kind of come down to shaping. I'll use the example, and this is going to be an example of a couple of things. This is a neck that I built for a bar guitar. That actually used to be that red Kramer. I referred to it as the Flabbercaster because it's not a light guitar. It was about a 10-pounder. Anyway, I had the parts just sitting down in my basement, and I decided to throw together a neck and throw it on there, so that way when the band I was playing in at the time, you know, if some drunken oaf decided to, you know, knock things over and my guitar went, I didn't care, because, you know, I think this was a $6 piece of maple. The fretboard, I think, was 10. These are the cheapest tuners that you could get on the interwebs. Yeah, it was cheap, and I think I built it in a weekend. I cut out the neck. I think I fretted it the next weekend, something like that. I mean, there wasn't a lot of time put in on this thing. So, long story short, I guess, is that, you know, I had to figure out on this one how I wanted to cut this out. So, you know, what I wound up doing there, I was able to use, I had a router actually and a router table, so that was how I figured that part. I used a belt sander actually to take this down to thickness here. And, you know, when you talk about mistakes, part of woodworking is learning how to recover from your mistakes. Like this right here, this pretty piece of maple is actually from the truss rod channel when I was cutting that on the router. The router bit went a little bit too deep in there, and went right down there, and that wasn't so great. So I wound up having to cut a filler strip that I wasn't intending to have and gluing that in. And so that's what that is. And then ultimately, my truss rod failed on this one because I don't know why, actually, because I haven't taken it apart. But I'm guessing somewhere in here there is a failure point for this truss rod. It didn't strip out, but as you can see, I kept having to shim and shim and shim, and eventually just stopped moving the neck entirely. But that's stuff to consider, and that's how you learn. Like, really, what did I lose on that? I mean, I used it for I don't know how many gigs. I used it for, you know, a couple of years, and it worked fine until it stopped working, and it was, you know, I think less than 30 bucks. Well, how else do you learn things? I mean, you can read about it in a book, but you don't really know it. You don't really know a thing until you work with it. You just think you know it. You know about it, but you don't know it. You know pieces of information about a thing until you work with it. Then you know it. It's kind of the way I feel about a lot of things, but you know, so that's the sort of thing to consider. So anyway, I guess kind of digressing a little bit. So you know, you have to think about what your tools are, what your tool budget is. You know, but I can tell you right this. Okay, you can cut this out with a coping saw. I'm pretty sure that's what I did. You know, just kind of got it roughly with the old table saw, and then I used a coping saw to cut that out, and then squared it up with oh gosh, I think this was a can of some sort with sandpaper wrapped around it and stuff like that, you know, getting some of these corners and things like that, you know. So I mean, there's a lot of making do with that sort of stuff. But yeah, another thing to consider is what sort of tooling can you build? What's your woodworking skill level? If you're not a great woodworker, I would not consider myself a particularly good woodworker. I can do okay. I'm okay. I mean, I could certainly be better. I mean, I know that there's a ceiling I could hit that, you know, that's pretty good, but that's not where I am. I mean, I would have to put in a lot more hours working with stuff, and you know, some of it's like, the magic isn't in having the tools. Just because you own a router doesn't mean you can work it very well. As I have learned in my life, just because you own a router does not mean you can run it well. So you need to pay attention to what you're doing and actually learn how to use your tools well. Makes sense. And then, you know, what can I buy? What should I build? You know, all of those considerations. Now, then you start talking about what kind of wood you want, because we haven't bought anything yet. We're just sitting here thinking about the list. Now, I've been rambling on here for however long, over 10 minutes, and we've talked about thinking about buying things, but we haven't talked about what you really need to buy. And because the truth is, if you want to try building a guitar, and it can be of your own design. I'm talking, you know, I mean, electrics. I haven't built any acoustics. I haven't actually owned, aside from my classical guitar, I haven't actually owned a steel string acoustic since like 1999. I don't play them. So there you go. Like, why haven't you built acoustic guitars? Because I don't want one. I would just go buy one. And I think about it every once in a while, like, I should have one, and I just don't do it. So there you go. But like a solid body electric, you can go to the store and buy the cheapest wood for the body if you want. I mean, you can build like whatever it is. Like linden or something, I don't know, poplar. I don't know what's cheap right now, but you can go and buy pine. You can build the body out of stud pine. I mean, it doesn't matter that much. So if you're on a pretty limited budget, you can do that sort of thing. And I would recommend not getting super invested in really expensive wood on a first guitar build, because you're going to be sitting there sweating over how you're going to cut into some old growth Honduran mahogany that, you know, you spent an entirely too much money on, and you have zero skill to work in. You know, so start with something that's reasonable, you know. But maple's cheap. Maple's cheap and plentiful, you know, so buy some maple for a neck, buy some cheap other wood for a body. You know, templates in order, draw out your plans, make your plans, start doing stuff. And if you screw it up, you've made some firewood. That's really the thing that I want to drive home with this, is most of this is thinking through how you're going to do things. And then there's the execution. But the real consequence of doing it wrong, I mean, outside of like the whole sort of, table saw accident, that makes you into a shop teacher, it's really, you're making firewood. At the end of the day, that's about the worst that you're doing. You've wasted some time and you've wrecked some cheap lumber. No one cares. So go ahead and try it. And then you can say, hey, you know what? That actually kind of worked out. I put enough time into it. And, the thing works. Because I'll tell you this right now. There's guys all over the internet building pine casters. They're cheap to build, and they're happy with the way they sound. They're snappy. Obviously the bodies aren't super durable because pine isn't exactly a super durable wood. But who cares? Everyone likes Telecasters that look like they've been beaten over a doggone brick anyway, so fine. Build that. It costs very little money, and then you can say, hey, I like doing that. That was a fun thing to do. Or you can say, well, I got bored with it, and I, don't really feel like doing that anymore. But then at least Then at least instead of spending the next 10 years thinking, I've always wanted to do that. I could maybe do that. I don't know if I could do that. I could never do that. Instead of just sitting there with these questions in your mind, try the thing, and then maybe you don't like doing it. Maybe you like the idea of having done it. And I think that's the truth for a lot of people. People like the idea of having done a thing. Fellow musicians, how many people I've always wanted to be able to, I wish I could play blah like that, or I've always wanted to be able to play blah song, or that sort of thing, from people who don't put the time in to actually learn how to play the instrument. And the truth is, people like that don't want to learn how to play the guitar. People want to have learned how. It's kind of like, when you need to quit smoking, thinking back to when I quit smoking, every smoker wishes they'd never started, because deep down inside, they don't want to quit. And it's true, because quitting sucks. It's hard. But if you could never have started, it's much easier. Just like if I could just know how to do the thing, it would be great. But you have to enjoy the process to enjoy the product, with so many of these things. And this is no exception. So to bring it to a close, make a little plan. If you've ever been curious about this, absolutely try it. Check out kits. See if that's something that interests you. Figure out a budget. If money's tight, understandably. So figure out where you can spend your money and where you don't need to. And put a lot of thought into it. Spend some time really thinking through all of these things. How are you going to cut body cavities? Look at another guitar and just think, okay, how am I going to drill that? How am I going to drill for the tuners? How am I going to cut body cavities? How am I going to make, cavity covers? What am I going to do for, this, that, or the other? There's all sorts of examples that you can use for a guitar, of things that you need to think through. So put some time into that. And you know what? If you get to the end of your list, if you get to where you know what style you're going to build, what your headstock's going to be like, how your tuner's going to be set up, what kind of tuners you're going to have, what the nut's going to be, what the fretboard's going to be, what size fret wire you're going to use, how you're going to put in that fret wire, what you're going to use for crowning those frets, and what you're going to use for doing fret ends and leveling, what you're going to do for inlays, how you're going to cut the inlay holes, how you're going to inlay the inlays, what you're going to do for radiusing. What radius do you want to have? Are you going to have a compound radius? You're going to have no radius. You're going to have a, like a 12 inch radius. What is the rest of the neck going to be like? Single piece, 3-piece, 5-piece? Is it going to have a single action truss rod, dual action truss rod? What's the neck joint going to be like? Is it going to be a mortise and tenon joint? Is it going to be a bolt-on neck? Is it going to be a Stevens extended cutaway? Is it going to be a neck through? Is it going to be a semi-neck through? Is it going to be a set through? What's the body going to be like? Is it going to be a single piece body? Is it going to be a multi-piece Strat style body? Is it going to be a sandwich style body like a Les Paul? Is it going to be a pancake body like a early 70s Les Paul? Is it going to have multiple woods in it? Is it going to be a single wood? What's your finish going to be like? Is it going to be acrylic lacquer, nitrocellulose lacquer, no finish, oil finish? Your hardware, your pickups, your bridge, your output jack. Where's the output jack going to be? Are you going to have a jack plate? What color is your jack plate going to be? What color is the guitar going to be? Where are you going to put the strap buttons? Are you going to use strap locks? Are you not going to use strap locks? See, it keeps going, and you're not done for a while. Once you get to the end of that and you can answer all of those questions, you're probably invested enough to try to build a guitar. Thanks all. Bye.